So welcome. My name is David Brashear. I know many of you in the room. I'm the director of the Muscarelle Museum, and really glad to welcome you to tonight's program, which is a bit of a kickoff. Before we get started, I did want to thank our sponsors. We have their logos up here on the screen. The Williamsburg Area Arts Commission has been very supportive of our efforts, and we really appreciate that support. Of course, we have support for our exploration series coming from the Williamsburg Landing, and then our presenting sponsor at our annual Wine and Run for the Roses event has been for the past few years MCV Foundation and VCU Health. So I always like to acknowledge them, and we're really grateful for their support. Well, as you know, the museum is now closed for our expansion project, but we're continuing to be a cultural force in the community, and our programming, I think, is as robust as ever. I want to tell you about a few of our upcoming events just before we get started. We've done a couple of field trips already this semester. We've gone to the National Gallery of Art. We've also gone to the Chrysler Museum, and upcoming is a trip to the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art to see the exhibition Carol Walker, Cut to the Quick. That's on April 20th, so if you want to join us, please just sign up through our website. And then this next trip we'll be doing is a little bit of a cross-section between a couple of our programs this spring, but we're going to go take a look at the renovation and expansion projects from an architectural perspective at the VMFA in Richmond and also the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And they're going to have some of their architects join us, and I think Alex is going to be there from the VMFA telling us about how that building has evolved over the course of the past 15 or 20 years, and soon to have another expansion in the not too distant future. It fits nicely, that trip, into our selected topics in architecture sequence this spring. We do this every spring. We have a few presentations about architecture, the world of architecture over the centuries. And that trip fits into this year's theme, which is museum design and museum architecture. We already talked about the invention of the museum. I think that was last week. And then on June 27th, I'm going to give a progress report on our new home for the Muscarelle Museum. But none of those programs are why you're here tonight. You're here for the kickoff of our Muscarelle Exploration Series for this spring, which we've entitled Modern Masters at the Margins. We're focusing in on the abstract expressionist movement of the mid-20th century, but really with a special focus on some of the names that didn't often get shined under the spotlight. And we're already underway, actually. As I mentioned, we did go to the National Gallery. On March 20th, we saw the Philip Guston Now exhibition, and it was wonderful. Charles Palermo, on the faculty here in art history, one of his good friends, Harry Cooper, is one of the curators at the National Gallery, and Harry put this exhibition together, and he came and greeted us, and we had a couple of great docents leading us around the museum as well. So a great trip, but it kind of kicked off the abstract expressionist sequence for this spring. And then last night, I know one or two people in this room were there with me. Our team member, Steve Prince, our director of engagement, did an abstract watercolor monotype workshop, and that was a lot of fun. So we've had a little bit of a warm-up, but tonight we're really going to get going. I'm going to talk about abstract expressionism kind of from a high level, talk about it as an American movement, and then I'll set up the forthcoming speakers who are going to visit us here on campus. On April 17th, Andriana Campbell-LaFleur, we're going to be here talking about a number of the players that didn't have the brightest light shining on them in the movement, but including Norman Lewis. Mr. Lewis was the only African American to be considered one of the first generation. We're going to talk a lot about first and second generation abstract expressionists tonight, but she's an expert in his work, and we're really pleased she's going to be coming from Yale University to talk about Mr. Lewis, a few of the other artists, and she'll be diving into this notational evolution, what the symbology was that these abstract artists were beginning to use. And then we're really thrilled to have Gail Levin, the noted author, coming to speak in a couple of sessions the last week of April. On April 25th, she'll be here. She's the biographer who wrote the amazing book on Lee Krasner. And she's going to spend time telling us about Lee Krasner's life. Lee, of course, one of the only women that really got much of the limelight in that first generation of abstract expressionists. And then fortunately, Gail is also doing quite a bit of research on Lynn Drexler, the Virginia originating artist who spent time studying here at William and Mary and has recently been the white-hot artist from the 20th century in the art market. So on April 27th, just 2 days later, that's a Thursday, Dr. Levin is going to tell us about her ongoing research into Lynn Drexler. On May 16th, I'll be joined by my good friend Gary Ryan from the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, and we're going to do a discussion, it's going to be virtual, on an amazing book, 9th Street Women by Mary Gabriel, talking about all the women who were engaged in the movement. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up on May 23rd. Danielle Moretti-Langholtz, the curator of Native American art here at the Muscarelle Museum, is going to talk about the work of an important Native American artist in the movement, and that man is George Morrison. So I hope you'll join us for some of those events, but tonight, as I said, we're starting with an overview. And our question is this: what is abstract expressionism, and how and why did it come to be? So I'm going to start with just a very brief and short description of abstract expressionism as an art form, and then we're going to spend some time highlighting the whys of the movement. And I'll end with an introduction to some of the artists who participated. So abstract expressionist art is, of course, non-representational. We all know that. And it's generally characterized by large gestural brushstrokes. Often it's been referred to as action painting, the movement of the artist around the canvas. And the marks that are made by the artist are intended to give the feeling of spontaneity, but I can tell you the reality really is, more often than not, that there's a deliberate organization of forms, or at least colors, in that final work of art. So works in this school have a relationship to surrealism, to cubism, also to the Bauhaus. But without question, and this is why it's important, the movement covered new ground. So I had the good fortune of attending the exhibition in, I think, early 2017. But in September 2016, the Royal Academy of Arts in London opened an exhibition entitled Abstract Expressionism. And in describing the show in the opening pages of that exhibition catalog, which used, by the way, this work by Jackson Pollock on the cover, the president of the Royal Academy described what he called American abstract expressionism this way. He said, "The creative energy and intelligence of arguably the most significant movement of the 20th century, enriched so profoundly by émigrés from a broken Europe, was a response to currents of thought amid major international events." And he went on to write that the artists were working through doubt and aesthetic risk to reestablish in the post-war era an authentic response to the great human question. So this is the generation that just witnessed the Great Depression, which was really a worldwide event coming out of World War I. They experienced World War II and all the horrors and dislocation that slowly was unveiled to them as news really got out from Germany. And then they also witnessed the massive destruction from the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. And so when the director of the Royal Academy says the great human questions, these were the great human questions that people of that generation were asking. So what I want to do is take a look at some of the forces, because this is where abstract expressionism as a movement gets interesting. There are a lot of things that are coming together to cause this movement to gain energy and momentum. And we're going to take a look at a number of them. So I'm going to talk about the Art Student League in New York, but this painting, many of you know, is in our collection. It's by Anna Meltzer, and she's actually in one of those classes, painting the class that she's in. But the Art Student League was a sort of siren in New York, and it employed over the years many of the most important artists in America as instructors. Early members of the faculty included Thomas Hart Benton, you're going to know a lot of these names, William Merritt Chase, John Twachtman, Augustus St. Gaudens, the sculptor, Thomas Aikens, Childe Hassam, and Arthur Wesley Dow. And many of the artists active in New York during the Great Depression took classes there under those instructors at the Art Students League. What's interesting is that artistically, America was in a very different place in the early 20th century. So thinking about some of those things I just discussed, in the shadows of those economic disparities of the 1920s, and energized by the crisis that ensued following the stock market crash in October 1929, American art was really driven by two main movements at the time. And these movements had a very prominent place in the curriculum of the Art Students League. The first was regionalism, which focused in on the lives of people living in rural America. And I think this painting I'm showing you right now, which is entitled Louisiana Rice Fields from 1928 by Thomas Hart Benton, really exemplifies well not only his body of work, but also that regionalism movement. And then the second was social realism, which is a movement that was in many respects worldwide, but it arose as a reaction to the hardships and problems that were experienced by so many around the globe, particularly in Europe and the United States and the Americas in general, in the early 20th century, and particularly in the aftermath of Black Friday on Wall Street. What the social realists did was take a sharp look at the direction society was taking. And they were pretty critical. They were critical of the social, the economic, and the racial conditions that made life very challenging for the working classes and the poor. And so the subject matter was often similar to what you're seeing on the screen, this work by Reginald Marsh, which is an etching entitled, and I think the title that he gave to this is really telling, Breadline, No One Has Starved, from 1932. There's a lot in that title. Well, the young artists who would form the core of what would become that abstract expressionist movement were highly influenced by the art around them and these two important movements. And Jackson Pollock was one of them. He was a native from Wyoming. He grew up in Arizona and California. He'd struggled in school and finally found his way through art and made his way to New York City. And he, of course, like many others coming to the city as artists or budding artists, he enrolled at the Art Students League. And he studied under Thomas Hart Benton, who was a prominent teacher there. And I think this practically looks like a work from Thomas Hart Benton, right? This work by Pollock, it was an early work. But he shifted, and this was beginning to happen at the Art Students League. Many of the students really didn't want to be realists. They didn't want to be regionalists. They wanted something different. They felt like there was a break that was needed, something new, and they started moving away from these professors. So that's the Art Student League, one of the big important forces that helped to bring about abstract expressionism. But what about the economy? To earn a living during the Depression was difficult for most working class people, but for struggling artists working in a profession that had never gained real status in America, it was nearly impossible. Luckily, in an effort to counter the financial distress in which so many of those artists found themselves during the early 1930s, Roosevelt's Work Progress Administration instituted something special and targeted in towards artists. It was called the Federal Arts Project, and that was started in 1934. And so for those artists who had come from around the country and mainly resided in the very inexpensive flats in the southern part of Manhattan, the Federal Arts Project was a godsend. What the project did was bring thousands of artists onto the federal payroll and changed lives in many, many ways. I learned a number of statistics that were kind of interesting to me as I prepared for this presentation, just about where women were in the American workforce following World War I. You know, Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a World War II phenomenon, it also happened in World War I. And when the soldiers came home, that's when women were sort of being pushed back into the home, and they decided the world needed to change. That was when women got the vote. A really interesting statistic I learned was that in the 1920s, and this surprised me, 40% of master's degrees in the United States were granted to women. 15% of PhDs went to women in the 1920s. That's a very early and significant mark, something I think that most of you wouldn't expect. And about 1/5 of the women, of the artists on the project, on the Federal Arts Project, were women, and interestingly, they received the same pay as men. But it was great for even men to be getting paid to be artists. The sculptor Ibram Lassah said this, he said that regular paychecks put an end to the idea that being an artist was somehow unmasculine. So there were unexpected consequences from the Federal Art Project that would affect and have an impact on this abstract expressionist movement. Well, first, it brought artists who were so used to being isolated and working alone, it brought them out and created a community that was often collaborative. In fact, many of the projects required collaboration, and the community was increasingly mutually supportive, and that's going to be important for the development of this movement. Second, it did something that I think is very interesting and also maybe a little bit unexpected and unintended. So a big part of the Federal Art Project was its public mural program. And I've highlighted, by the way, the workers, over 900 of just about 5,200 workers in the Federal Arts Project were employed in this public mural program. And what it gave these artists was the idea and practice executing large-scale visual arts projects. What it did was make them comfortable with creating works of enormous scale. Most artists weren't working in this way prior to this. And in fact, if you think about it, even just purchasing large amounts of canvas was generally beyond the capability for most artists who were living on a very limited income. It was about 20%, almost 20% of the participants were working in the mural program. And here's one of them, Marshall Gorky, working on one of his sequence of murals in his aviation project in Newark Airport. What the Federal Art Project was, not only in the mural program, but pretty much across the board, it's bringing these artists together, and it's in many respects an on-the-job training program. They're getting to do things that they weren't necessarily doing before. And their involvement in this project was one of the ways that some of the participants, like Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner and Willem de Kooning and Arshil Gorky and Adolf Gottlieb and Mark Rothko, actually came to know each other. Think about how big some of those names are in terms of what you know. But there were a lot of other influences on these artists, and a lot of it was coming from Europe in a variety of forms, so it's not always direct. One was through a fledgling museum in the city. The Museum of Modern Art had opened a month, if you can believe it, after the stock market crashed in 1929. But since that opening, since its inception, it had delivered an ongoing parade of European modernism. And that wasn't by mistake. Those first founding practitioners at the Museum of Modern Art were really hyper-focused on Europe and what was happening there. They felt like modernism hadn't really come to the United States, and part of the mission of the Museum of Modern Art was going to be to educate America, to bring America along. But some of those early exhibitions highlighted the light of the Impressionists, the emotional confrontation with color and shape of the Expressionists, the fields of motion of the Futurists, and the reaction by the Cubists to nature through a series of angles and planes. And what happened? The museum became one of the playgrounds for the artists who were attempting to make a living while charting their own paths in New York. It was a way to immense one in the spirit of art and in many respects in the spirit of the times, but they may have been the times that were happening in Europe. Beginning in November 1935, the Museum of Modern Art kicked off a sequence of exhibitions that made it a great time to go to school there, so to speak. In quick succession, the museum hosted, beginning in November of 1935, a biographical exhibition on Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh was someone who most people really hadn't seen, they hadn't experienced him, and we all know our own personal reaction to the works of Vincent van Gogh. They moved on from that in the spring of 1936, having a survey exhibition on Cubism and abstract art. And I love the cover of this exhibition catalog that was done by director Alfred Barr. He's charting the evolution of all the artistic movements through the 18th and 19th century and into the 20th, and how you actually get to Cubism and abstract art from his perspective. And then near the end of that year, 1936 and into early 1937, they had a show featuring 700 objects, and that show was called Fantastic Art, Dada, the movement, and Surrealism. So in short order, really, the museum had presented essentially the history of the modern movement up until that moment in time. And the best thing about this school, located right there in the center of Midtown Manhattan, was, especially for these artists, it was free. For a cash-strapped artist community in the city, the price really couldn't have been any better. And what did artists do? They went there regularly. A day out would be coming up from southern Manhattan and spending time at the Museum of Modern Art, seeing what was on offer. It was a way to learn about art. It was a way to digest what you're seeing, but it was also a way, ultimately, I think, to discover oneself, to figure out who you were as an artist. Well, Europeans contributed in other ways. Hans Hofmann had established a very successful art school in Munich in 1915. And what he was doing was incorporating the ideas and bringing them together and trying to help modern art evolve. He linked Cézanne and Kandinsky and the Cubists, and he preached this abstracted, modernistic approach to art. He came to the United States. He had a number of short-term teaching projects. He was going to be here for a brief amount of time, but he liked it, and he decided to establish a firmer foothold in America. And he opened in 1934 the Hans Hofmann School of Fine Arts in New York City, and quickly followed that with a summer art program and school in Provincetown on Cape Cod. He's going to touch a lot of these artists, and I'm showing you here one of our prized possessions at the Muscarelle Museum, a gift of Doris and Ralph Lamberson, an estate gift from the early 2000s, but this is color poem number 1 from 1950. Well, what did Hofmann do? He taught drawing from models in still life, but he urged his students to see something more, to push beyond basic representations. Don't give back a photograph of what you've seen. Give back something that is different. He wanted you to be personal. And he urged you to consider rendering that subject, rendering that scene in a two-dimensional color array that was maybe more suggestive than representational. And he urged the students even to take it a step further. He wanted them to sort of become one, become spiritually invested in the work that they were trying to put together and in the way they were portraying the subjects in their images. He was immensely popular. As a teacher, as a personality, Hoffman was the person that people wanted to be with, and they wanted to learn from him. And many of the first generation of those avant-garde artists in New York were students of his in the 1930s. So another way that Europeans are impacting the development of the abstract expressionists. Here's another way. John Graham, he changed his name from a very difficult Ukrainian origin to John Graham, but he made his way to the United States and had a big impact. He hadn't studied, he had more of a classical education in the Ukraine, but he was a quick study, and he focused on art when he came to the United States. Many considered the man to be a genius. He was erudite on many different topics. He became a painter, but he was also a theorist and a very well-regarded connoisseur. And he was friendly with many of the abstract expressionists and became an important mentor to them. And then he published this book called System and Dialectics of Art. And at that moment in time, it was more of almost an instruction manual, another way to think. But when you look back on that 1937 book in 1950, when the abstract expressionist movement really sort of first officially launched itself, it's been said that that book, System and Dialectics of Art, is maybe as close to a manifesto that that movement ever really had. And everyone read that book. Many were influenced by what they read, and Graham was considered even more so to be a guiding light. And people would ask him his opinion on their art, and they were eager to hear what he had to say. He also had the ear of many of the gallerists, and so what John Graham said often helped an artist gain access to a gallery or a sequence of galleries. Well, then, of course, Paris fell to the Nazis in June of 1940, and that really cut off the center of the global art world from the rest of the world. Leading Parisian artists, many of whom had gathered there from other countries in Europe, some of them surrealists, they fled to America, and that added to the number who had been emigrating already since 1939 as conditions had deteriorated quite a bit in Europe. Some of the more prominent exiles that came to America, and the list goes on, and the names are big, but people like Fernand Léger, Marc Chagall, Piet Mondrian, Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, Yves Tanguy, among many, many others. And really by this act of war, by this invasion of Paris, kind of instantly, New York became the center of the art world. Having all of these important artists in town had a major impact in several ways, and I think they're really interesting. Their creative energy, of course, was one of the major impacts, but perhaps maybe the one that was more important was this. While the Europeans and the American artists knew about the Europeans, they hadn't seen all the works, but they knew who was being talked about. Across the ocean, and really unknown to them in any deep way, for the Americans, these Europeans seemed almost as gods. But once they intermingled in the artist circles in New York and became more well-known, they began to be taken down from their pedestals. When you get to know somebody, you know that they're not always awesome all day long, every day, that they have their own little quirks and issues, and maybe they're not the nicest people, and maybe they don't get along with others. And knowing them for these American artists, knowing these European artists to be mere mortals, gave the American artists, who always felt like the underdogs, a great amount of additional confidence. They felt maybe more of an opportunity, more of a license to express themselves. So the gradual coalescing of the group that would later be known as the New York School, or the abstract expressionists, and those terms are sometimes used interchangeably, were helped along by a variety of forces. And one of them was the Artists' Union, which was founded in 1933, which had gradually evolved to be one of the primary drivers of artists' funding in that WPA project that Roosevelt had started. The union's meetings, they were held on Wednesday evenings, were often attended by 200 to 300 artists in southern Manhattan, sometimes many more. And for a few years, the union's second-floor loft on West 15th Street became one of the principal social and cultural meeting places for artists in New York. Another important force was the formation of a group, the American Abstract Artists Group, which was formed in 1936 with this aim of promoting the public's understanding of abstract art. You know, it was funny last night in Steve Prince's workshop, he talked about the fact that many people have a difficult time understanding abstract art or even giving it any respect. And I think the common phrase that he said he's heard a million times, and artists always have, is when they're looking at abstract art, oh, I could do that. Well, the public was not really well versed in abstract art. They hadn't seen much of it, and the American Abstract Artists Group wanted to change that. And in 1937, in April, 39 members of the group exhibited their work at the very first AAA exhibition at the Squibb Gallery. There weren't many exhibitions of abstract art up until that time, but this was the largest exhibition ever to take place outside of a major museum. And what was interesting is it managed to catch the attention of many of the important players in the New York art world. So I'll let you look at this image for a few minutes. But I wanted to step back for a moment and take a look at the relationships that were strengthening and the affiliations that were forming among those artists in New York. I mentioned earlier that in abstract expressionism, we talk about the first generation and the second generation. The second generation would come largely after World War II, but the first generation was beginning to coalesce in the 1930s and into World War II, and really hitting the heights after World War II. It's generally difficult to chart women through this movement because the histories of the group that were written in the 20th century, and honestly up until very recently, were biased away from them. But really at the time, women were generally welcomed as equals and were an important part of these artist circles in Manhattan. Only one, though, was allowed a major presence in the biography of the New York School, and that was Lee Krasner. She was definitely a force, an incredibly talented artist, but maybe the reason that she was able to make her way into all of those biographies that were written in the 20th century and in the early parts of the 21st century was because she was the wife of Jackson Pollock, an amazing factor in his own commercial success and artistic development. Pollock and Krasner worked back and forth with each other. They would critique each other's art, and Pollock was actually, he was reticent to show work that he didn't feel was ready to Lee, but once he felt it was ready, he couldn't wait to see and hear her assessment of what he was doing. Well, this photo was taken in 1951 by Nina Lean, and it was first presented in Life magazine, but it shows some of the major players in this first generation of abstract expressionists. And one of the problems with the group of abstract expressionists is we might be able to get into a game at a cocktail party where we just keep going back and see how long we could last. Who would be the last one able to come up with a name? Because the list is long. There are a lot of players who were both central in this movement, who were sort of in ring 1, in ring 2, in ring 3 as it sort of radiated out. A lot of the artists in New York who were working in art as a profession at that time were working in an abstract way. So what's interesting here is there's only one woman in this photo, and her name is Hedda Stern. But I just told you that Lee Krasner was probably the only woman who was really accorded any real presence in the biographies of that first generation of abstract expressionists. What's interesting about Hedda Stern is she was incredibly talented, as many of the women were in that first generation, but history sort of lost track of them. And her foundation on their web pages describing the life of Hedda Stern talk about she's more well known for this photograph than for any of the art that she ever produced, and often with a question mark, like why is she there? She had many solo exhibitions. She was well acknowledged as a very important artist at the time, but I said barely mentioned. But a lot of these other people were. Well, some of the artists began to come together through galleries and exhibitions, and the powerful gallerists and curators who served really as the arbiters on the quality of artistic production in New York had a big impact. And I'm going to talk to you now about 3 women, and they're all amazing. The first one being Hilaire Rebay, and we actually bought a work by Hilaire Rebay, who was a noted abstract artist, into our collection a couple of years ago. It's a great one. It's going to be out being cleaned at a conservator soon, but we're anxious to present it to all of you when we reopen in a couple of years. She was an evangelist for abstract art. She called it non-objective art, really meaning that it had no ties to the natural world, and she believed this non-objective art was a much higher calling than representational art. She developed a very close business relationship with Solomon Guggenheim, who was an art collector, but she shifted his direction. She got Guggenheim interested in abstract works, and as his collection grew, she urged him to develop a museum for that growing collection. And that was really one of her goals when she came to America, to get a museum off the ground for abstract art. So in 1939, following the creation of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, she got her wish. The Museum of Non-Objective Painting, and it's a great name, opened in 1939 in temporary quarters on East 54th Street with Rebay as the director. And so now abstract artists had another new home, and Rebay would end up connecting with many of those abstract artists. Peggy Guggenheim's another very important player. Solomon was her uncle. The Art of This Century Gallery was her project. She opened it on West 57th Street in 1942. But she was really focused on Europeans. The gallery, importantly, was part of what was becoming a Midtown Arts District that included now the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, the Guggenheim Rebay project, and numerous commercial galleries. This is where all the uptown galleries were in Manhattan, in that 57th Street corridor. And her gallery showcased the works, as I said, by established European artists, but she also occasionally let in lesser-known American artists. And so she became an important nexus for those two groups. Guggenheim was a very important and early supporter and patron of Jackson Pollock, somewhat unwillingly at first, but then a little bit more willingly as time marched on. Sadly, though, this gallery only lasted 5 years. Once the war was over, Guggenheim was very excited to move back to Europe, and that's, in fact, where she went. We did a board trip to Venice in 2016, I think it was, and we actually got to have dinner. That was where she ended up. We got to have dinner at her house, which is now a museum, right on one of the canals in Venice. A great, great place. Another important woman in this movement was Betty Parsons. She was a keystone in the crystallization of the abstract movement. She'd had several positions in the gallery world, but she opened her own on 57th Street in 1946. So you can see these happening in rapid sequence, right? 1937, 1942, 1946. And what Betty Parsons did is she exhibited regularly 12 shows a season, from September to May, Each show was focused on an artist or a set of artists. It only lasted 2 or 3 weeks, so she had sort of that turnover, a lot of presentation, a lot of material. And she was the only dealer willing to represent many of the artists. Artists like Jackson Pollock, after Peggy Guggenheim closed her Art of this Century Gallery. Parsons also showed work by Clifford Still, by Theodorus Stamos, Ellsworth Kelly, Mark Rothko, Hedda Stern, Judith Godwin, and Robert Rauschenberg, among many, many others. And Helen Frankenthaler, the painter, who met Parsons in 1950, said this. She said, "Betty and her gallery helped construct the center of the art world." So really much credit can be given to these 3 women, to Hilaire Bay, to Peggy Guggenheim, and to Betty Parsons for giving what really amounted to being a foundational floor to this emerging abstract movement. By 1951, with some of the stones already in place, the abstract movement was ready to shine their light out to the world. They were a bit frustrated by most of the New York art establishment, and so a group of artists from what was called the Club, which was an 8th Street loft where many of them hung out, they got together and decided to organize their own show. And the show was the 9th Street Art Exhibition of Paintings and Sculpture. It opened on May 21st, 1951, in an old furniture warehouse that someone had found in Lower Manhattan. And they had spent weeks preparing this place. It was sort of like a community building project. But now this exhibition is definitely considered to be historic. But then this artist exhibition marked the formal debut, really, of the abstract expressionist movement. And it was a coming out of sorts for many of the artists who were showing their work there. A lot of these artists had not yet made it into a commercial art gallery. Many of the names that we now consider to be legendary were in this show, but at that time, most of them were unknown. So who were the artists of the abstract expressionist movement, or what we might call the New York School? I'm going to show you a number of those artists now. You're going to know many of them, if not all of the artists, but some may be new to you. And I'm going to mention first some of the first generation artists, and then I'll call out a few of the second generation artists. But remember, this too is only a short sample of who the players were. So I'll start with maybe the most obvious, Jackson Pollock, of course. One of the most revered of the first generation. Many of the prominent players in the art establishment considered him to have made the biggest move, the most profound statement. Famous, of course, for his drip or action paintings that he created, and showing one here from 1950. And when you're talking about Pollock, you have to talk next about Lee Krasner. She's, of course, married to Pollock. She was a fervent artist. Art was what made her get up in the morning. But she really, as I mentioned earlier, laid her personal ambitions aside to help promote the career of her husband. And I'm happy to say this work, composition from 1950, a lithograph, we have this in the collection of the Muscarelle Museum. I know many of you have seen it before. Adolf Gottlieb, so amazing. We have a work by him in the collection as well. He believed that art should be an expression of the unconscious. And if you know much about Gottlieb's work, I think you can feel that resonate in his work. He felt a real kinship with the Surrealists, another first-generation artist. Robert Motherwell, one of the most articulate of the artists in the movement, he often touched on political themes in his work. And here is one of the many, many paintings he did in remembrance of the Spanish Republic after Franco had gained control. And he only named these paintings later, but he called the sequence Elegy to the Spanish Republic. Beautiful work. We can see these paintings pretty well, can't we? Okay, great. Willem de Kooning, very eclectic painter. Strong affinity to Cubism, but he went on to say that he could really be influenced by any art that he saw. And he was influenced by art, and he would paint in a certain direction after seeing something that moved him. He, interestingly, didn't see himself as a pure abstract artist. He thought of himself a bit more as a cubist. Arshile Gorky, widely loved by the group. He was an Armenian who had come to the United States. He had a great spirit. He was really one of the favorites of all the artists. And his style morphed from a cubist orientation to more of a surrealist one. But throughout his artistic production period, he was dedicated to abstract and non-representational art. Franz Klein, some amazing works by this man. He's known for his black and white paintings. And he had a great interest in Japanese prints. And he considers his works to be spontaneous creations, but they've often been linked to Japanese calligraphy. He always denied this. He said calligraphy is for writers, and I'm not a writer, I'm an artist. But some have seen calligraphy with Japanese origins in his art. Ad Reinhardt is one of the most pure of the abstract artists. His work was never figurative. And when some of his geometric works were highlighted for, and he took this as an insult, for their decorative quality and beauty, he just completely rebelled. And so these paintings that he did in colors previously, he began to do in various shades of black, bit as a protest. But I'll tell you some amazing works. Philip Guston, who's currently featured in a major exhibition that I was telling you about at the National Gallery in Washington, created both abstract and figurative works. And if you haven't seen this exhibition, it's so close, Washington. I'm going to urge you to get up there. You can always have a great day or an overnight trip to Washington, but the Guston exhibition is substantial, it's a retrospective, and it covers all of his art. Some of his art may or may not appeal to you. I think, and people on that trip will probably agree, that his abstract works were unbelievable, really compelling in the center of that exhibition. Clyfford Still is a great story. He was a Westerner. He wanted to be an artist. He arrived in New York, I think at the age of 20, and he came to immerse himself in art. So where did he end up? Of course, he showed up at the Art Students League, but he found it, like many of them did, all too traditional. So he moves away, he moves into abstract art, away from that traditional approach, and decides also to move away from New York. It really wasn't his thing. And throughout his life, he distances himself from New York. He didn't like the teaching when he was there, but he also felt that the art establishment was a bit corrupt. It was a rough way to practice art, and it was hard to make your way and break in. What's really interesting about Clyfford Still is about 90% of his life's work is housed in Denver in the Clyfford Still Museum. So if you want to see the great work of Clyfford Still, you just need to make a trip to Denver and you're going to see most of it. Barnett Newman, he was an intellectual and one of the foremost color field painters in that abstract group. And he often incorporated very simplistic forms. And in particular, he's noted for the vertical bands he put in his paintings. He wanted people to try to inhabit his paintings. And so he gave them visual markings that sort of gave you a relation to what was going on in those big, strong patches of color. I mentioned Norman Lewis as being the only African American in that first generation of abstract expressionists, but I can tell you he was at the table. You can find photos right and left of groups of abstract expressionists meeting, and you'll see Norman Lewis there in the group. His movement to abstraction is said to be due, at least in part, to his disillusionment with America and its handling of racial issues. He had been in World War II, he had fought for the country, he came home, and he was kind of surprised that we still weren't making any progress. His later works, which are now much sought after, and we have tried to buy really interesting works a number of times at auction by Norman Lewis because they're amazingly compelling. We do have one in the collection that we managed to buy at auction. It's on the cover of our Explorations trifold. This is a beautiful, beautiful print that we bought several years ago, but that's the only work that we have by Norman Lewis. His works are very sought after, highly, highly priced, but generally he morphed into a scheme where he blended abstraction with sort of a loose figuration. Really interesting. You can sense this movement in his paintings. Another artist we love, and I'm able to show you a work in our collection, is George Morrison, the Ojibwe Native American painter, artist, who is one of the few Native Americans in the abstract movement. He won a traveling scholarship as a young man, and he traveled to New York, and of course, got into the circle with all the other abstract expressionists. He too ended up at the Art Students League, and there he learned about Cubism and Surrealism from some of those less traditional instructors. This work was given to the university by Gene Kreisler as one of many works of abstract expressionists that came to the university in the 1950s or 1960s. Interestingly, he's so prominent, he had a sequence of postage stamps issued by the U.S. Postal Service last year. And Danielle Moretti Langholtz, our curator of Native American art, who I love so much, she's always worried when I go on the road or even apparently out to the post office. So I called Danielle because I asked the post office when I was there buying stamps, who is this artist? And I did a little research, and he was a Native American. And she's done such a great job of building our collection of contemporary and near contemporary Native American works. So I asked Danielle, do we have any works by George Morrison? And she said, no. And I said, why? And she said, well, he's on the list, we just haven't got around to him yet. So we both set out on a quest to find works by him, and in pretty short order found some that we really were interested in and bought two into the collection. And then one day, a few months later, I was in our great Melissa Paris's office, deputy director at the museum, and she said, I have some news. I don't know how you're going to feel about it. And she said, turns out we have a work by George Morrison, this one I'm showing you right now. And we, of course, had it stewarded perfectly. But we had previous registrars at the museum had never noted in the database that George Morrison was a Native American artist. So when you did a search in the database of all the works by Native Americans, this work never came up. So I think it was actually good fortune because we didn't think we had any, and then we energetically went out and found two, and now we have three works by the amazing George Morrison in the museum's collection. So it's really a thrill, and we're all very proud of that. William Baziotes was friends with many of the abstract expressionists. His work was often more figurative than that of his colleagues and more in line, and I think you can see this in this work called Pierrot in the National Gallery of Art. He's more in line with Europe's surrealists. Can you believe I've mentioned this many artists already and haven't even scratched the surface? And now I'm getting to Mark Rothko. After originally being a figurative artist, Rothko moved to abstraction, and he developed this very sophisticated color field orientation in his work. He's considered to be one of the central players in the movement, not only for his abstraction, but also for his embrace of very large canvases. So they're gradually moving to these large canvases. They've learned how to construct and create on a big tablet, but he's one of the first ones to really move there aggressively. And that got others thinking about it. But the reason why he moved there was he had something to say with color, and he wanted his viewers to be immersed in his work, almost surrounded by what they were seeing. So Elaine de Kooning is interesting because she sort of bridges between that first generation and the second generation. She, of course, was young and married Willem de Kooning, the emigre from the Netherlands. And she was interested in being an artist maybe a bit more than Lee Krasner was. So Elaine wasn't going to put her art career sort of in second place behind the work of her husband. And so they continued to create sort of side by side for many, many years. She was an amazing spirit. He loved her for her spirit, but many, many people loved her. She was one of those powerful forces that moved around southern Manhattan that everyone really wanted to know. She was an abstract painter, but she also loved portrait art. And she sort of developed a style of portrait art, sort of this very loose, abstract approach. And she was well regarded. The Kennedys asked her to do a portrait of JFK, which is an amazing work. So let's move on from that first generation. We'll use Elaine as the bridge and come into some of the artists who are second generation. And second generation begins to broaden out just a bit. And I'm going to go very broad with my first one, and we're going to talk about Lynn Drexler. Lynn was born in Newport News. She actually studied art at William and Mary, among several other places, and made her way to New York. She worked with Hans Hofmann. She's best known for her synthesis of post-impressionism and abstract expressionism in her depictions of landscapes. And really, when you look at this work, and we actually have a work by Lynn Drexler in our collection that's very beautiful. It's from her time when she was a student here. But this, we look at Lynn Drexler works all the time. Sadly, we can no longer afford them. But this is maybe my favorite one that I've seen out in the market, and I've seen many over the course of the past 18 months. This was offered at auction in Bonhams in Los Angeles last September. And I think it was estimated to go for $40,000 to $50,000, and it went for just about $1 million. This is the story of Lynn Drexler. You could have bought her works 5 years ago for about 1/100th of what you would pay today in the art market. She is the brightest burning light right now in the art world. And she's someone who was, I mean, you can see the caliber of this work, right? This is really, really strong, and was just swept under the carpet for decades. No one really paid attention. She was a bit of a recluse. She had gotten frustrated with the New York art scene and just retired to Maine and spent much of her life there. And a few of those museums in Maine have a treasure trove of great work by Lynn Drexler. Another Virginia story in that second generation is Nell Blaine, and I'm showing you a work that we do have in our collection by Nell Blaine. It was one that Melissa found coming up at auction a couple of years ago, and it's a beautiful, beautiful work. It's called Still Life, New York. She was from Richmond, and upon her arrival in New York was broadly embraced by the group, the older and the younger of the artists, mainly for her spirit. She was just intensely fun to be with. She painted in a variety of styles, though. Abstract was one of them. I'm, of course, not showing you an abstract work. And I think an important connection for us to Nell Blaine was that in 1996, she was given the Cheek Medal by the Muscarelle Museum. Unfortunately, she was very sick at the time. She wasn't able to come and receive the medal. Someone accepted it in her honor, and sadly, she died later that year in 1996. But we have a nice connection as well to Nell Blaine. Grace Hardigan. This is someone who gained recognition very early in her career. She was a noted abstract artist who was bought into the collection of MoMA, now a few decades old, at the young age of 31. So this artist, a woman artist, is selling a work into MoMA at age 31. Life magazine referred to her in the 1950s as the most celebrated of the young American women painters. Joan Mitchell was a force, a multi-talented artist. She worked in a variety of media in a variety of ways, but she's one of the most acclaimed of the later abstract artists. And like Hartigan, she was very commercially successful early in her career. She started out in New York, but she also felt the pulls from another place. She decamped in France in the 1950s, and she stayed there for most of the rest of her life. Helen Frankenthaler. This woman was all in as an abstract artist and experimented greatly with materials, thinning out paints, pouring them on canvases. And I think we're going to end almost with this. I have one or two more slides, but Helen Frankenthaler said this, and it kind of encapsulates the whole movement. There are no rules. That is how art is born, how breakthroughs happen. Go against the rules or ignore the rules. That is what invention is about. So my last work that I'm going to show you is a work by Pearl Fine. Pearl also studied with Hans Hofmann and was a member. She had many solo exhibitions in New York. She would be in that first generation. We, for the first time, had our curator circle group of members who give it a certain level for a dinner last weekend in the Great Hall. And myself and Melissa Paris and Danielle, we each presented works that were to be voted on and then selected to be bought into the collection of the Muscarelle Museum. And we had some amazing works of art between the three of us. But this is one that's coming, hopefully, to the collection of the Muscarelle by Pearl Fine. It's called Cool Series number 45, Striated Yellow, from 1961 to 1963. We're thrilled to be getting it, and we can't believe she went to the trouble to paint it in William and Mary's colors, so we're thrilled. It's going to be the new face of art here at William and Mary. So I wanted to tell you, tonight was just an introduction to this very interesting and important art movement from the 20th century, but I want you to remember that we have 4 very exciting upcoming lectures that's going to allow you to dig quite a bit deeper. And that's really, as you know, those of you who come to the museum often, the guiding rationale for our Muscarelle Exploration series that we put on each semester. It's that opportunity over a period that may be just a few weeks long to kind of immerse yourself, to dig deep, and to learn intensely about a topic in the art world. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll take any questions if anybody has them. And if you do have a question, if you raise your hand, Julie has a microphone, she can bring it over. And if there are no questions, that's fine as well. All right, Marlene, we'll let you have it.
Arshil Gorky?
Can you?
Oh, the artist Arshil Gorky.
Yes.
When I looked at when he was born and died, he was only 44 when he died. Do you know why? Was there some tragic accident or something?
Yes, there was a tragic accident, and I don't want to, no, I'm not sure if there was a tragic accident because I'm thinking about 2 artists right now, one of whom died of pneumonia and the other committed suicide. And is that what Gorky did? He was the suicide. Yeah, it was very sad. You know, his parents had escaped the Armenian genocide, and he had witnessed all of that, and it bore heavily on him throughout his life.
The 2 exhibits at the Museum of Modern Art in 1935, who was the driving force behind those exhibits?
Oh my gosh, so there were a lot of driving forces at the Museum of Modern Art from its inception in the late 1920s and into the 1930s. So of course there's a group of women who are bringing it all together and they want to do something different. But they hired Alfred Barr, and he worked together really closely with Philip Johnson, who was a bit of an art aficionado, kind of came to art through the back door, eventually became a very prominent architect. And they were focused. They made many trips to Europe. Not only art was important to be presented at the Museum of Modern Art in its most modern sense and in a prescriptive way from Europe, quite frankly, But the 1932 exhibition of modern architecture from Europe was one of the most important exhibitions that the museum ever put on. And their sole goal in that exhibition was really to kind of knock American architects on the head and say, what are you doing? Where is your modern movement? This is what's happening around the world. So they're enamored of what's going on in Europe, and they go back and forth constantly. In fact, I forget the city that Alfred Barr was in when the Nazis rolled in, and he then, with his wife, made a fairly quick escape. But they spent a lot of the late 1920s and early 1930s in Europe. Well, thank you all for coming. We're having a reception in the lobby here, so I hope you'll join us. And if anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Appreciate your being here.